עזה לא תיראה אותו הדבר. אנחנו נגיע למצב בו מי שהנהיג את עזה יוכה קשה, נפרק אותו. ומי שיישאר שם יבין היטב שדבר כזה לא עושים למדינת ישראל.
Israeli military leaders there vowing to destroy Hamas and speaking on objectives to, quote, dismantle Gaza, where many buildings have already been reduced to rubble. Israel is vowing a campaign to identify, to separate, and kill Hamas terrorists from the rest of the Gaza area. We've discussed with experts tonight why that is so difficult. Within Israel, there is a crisis unlike anything in this country's history. There's the immediate emergency priority to respond and to rescue the hostages, but there's also broader concerns about where this war and the regional conflict could lead. Consider what one Israeli national security veteran notes, that destroying Hamas, quote, entirely today does not even mean that its ideology would end, arguing, quote, Hamas is a collection of people with religious faith. The belief cannot be erased. Also concerns about what taking any type of full control or occupation of Gaza would entail, with reportedly, quote, little appetite for that in the new unity government of Israel, according to New York Times reporting. We turn to a longtime diplomat, Ambassador Marc Ginsberg. He was a Mideast advisor to President Jimmy Carter, involved in peace negotiations at that time. Ginsberg was born in the United States. He was raised in Israel and was also tapped to be ambassador to Morocco under then President Clinton, which made him the first Jewish American to serve as an ambassador for the United States in an Arab country, a point noted in accounts at the time. Ambassador, welcome. This is your first time joining us on air here this week since this occurred. We have much to get to. But starting big picture, set the table for people who don't maybe follow this as closely why the weekend's attack was, as our own longtime reporter Martin Fletcher put it, the most serious that Israel may have faced.
Well, my hat's off to Martin Fletcher. I've followed him for decades. He's one of the best, if not the best, in the region, and you're lucky to have him. Look, Ari, this was more challenging than the two wars that I served when I was in Israel in 1967 and 73. I didn't serve in the military, but I went back to volunteer. Israel was surprised, but this was a war between armies. This attack that occurred at the kibbutzim on the southern tier of Gaza was such a dastardly attack in its savagery, but more importantly, it caught Israel off guard. For 3.5 hours, there was not a battalion, not a corporal, no one with a submachine gun that was able to defend the people who were being raped, pillaged, murdered, decapitated. And that's just a terrible testament to the failure of the intelligence forces that had built a false sense of security that somehow or other, because it was a holiday in Israel, it would remain a holiday for Hamas.
Hamas has put out various communications. They've put out various propaganda. We sift through everything here. I tell viewers what makes air has gone through a process. And so here I want to quote what a Hamas spokesperson said because we think it relevant. The group had achieved, quote, more than it had even hoped to in its attack. They said they basically achieved this through a 3,000-person battalion with about 1,500 backup. The New York Times also pointed to that account, and I ask you, Ambassador, do you take that at face value? What is the end game when they hit this hard and take this many civilians, including Americans, back into Gaza?
Well, the hostage situation is going to be probably almost as important as the fate of the Palestinians who are fleeing to the south. Your prior guest sort of painted a monolithic view of Palestinians in Gaza as if they are the poor victims of Hamas. And why is Hamas being not given more support by Egypt? And everyone has to understand that there's no monolithic way to look at the Palestinians inside Gaza, just the way you can't look and judge the Palestinians in the West Bank. I worked in the mid-2000s as the head of the Peaceworks Foundation in both Gaza and in Palestine, and I have a pretty damn good understanding of how Hamas operates and who among the population supports them, who opposes them, and it's a mixed bag. To say that these people have been placed in a terrible harm's way for all of the years that Hamas has ruled them, I would say that that story is only half true. The other story is that they suffer from a bad case of Stockholm syndrome. And more importantly, there's never been an alternative, and the world has never offered a power, even though it's illegitimate. And even also, Egypt doesn't want them because Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The last thing that Egypt wants is a ideological infusion of diabolical, radical Muslim Brotherhood ideology pouring over its border by adherence to Hamas. And so you have to look at this perspective as, yes, we can shed a lot of crocodile tears for the poor victims of Hamas, but many of these people, I'm not talking about the children, but many of these people did not do anything over the last 15 years to shed a drop of blood to overthrow Hamas.
Right, and you're partly responding to what another guest said, but that is the complexity there. And then there's, of course, the nature of the population, right? And you're talking about whether we're adult age and who has that choice or whether they feel oppressed by that. But as you're reminding people, Egypt and others are not exactly helping what would be the alleged humanitarian crisis with a lot of pain and suffering associated with that. That's sort of the big picture, and I mentioned your extensive background, which is why we've called on you on foreign policy issues throughout the years, Ambassador. We also wanted to acknowledge something difficult, your personal connection to this tonight. Your nephew, Eli, was killed in one of the operations that is attempting to rescue the hostages taken by Hamas over this past weekend. He led a special forces unit into a kibbutz in Israel. He was shot by Hamas. He was 42 years old, and we know it leaves behind his wife and 4 young children. The story and the devastation affects so many people and people's lives, and I want to give you a chance to speak on that.
Eli was a Navy SEAL, rose to the level of the leadership of the commando school in Israel, and had just been decommissioned 3 weeks ago to return home, promised his wife. His days with the special forces was over with. He would devote his attention to his children, his wonderful children, who I love dearly. As you may recall, Ari, his father, my brother, was killed in 2006 during the Lebanese war. So my sister-in-law, who lives on Kibbutz Mizgavam, with my other nephews, has lost her husband and now her son, who is a real hero. And what he was called up to do was to lead a special forces unit to rescue hostages from that dance festival who had been taken hostage at Kibbutz Re'im. And during an attempted rescue operation, he was shot by one of the terrorists and died immediately. He was buried. Unfortunately, I was unable to get to his funeral in time. But over 1,000 leading officials of Israel came because he was quite famous. He had led many a raid against Palestinian terrorists, not only in Gaza, but had his elbow blown off about 10 years ago in a fight with the Popular Liberation Front for Palestine in one of the West Bank towns. And so he had sacrificed quite a bit, and now he on behalf of our family, he's paid the ultimate sacrifice. But I can tell you, he was not someone who had hatred towards the Arabs. He was what I always raised him to be and what my brother raised him to be, a passionate believer in Israel's destiny and right to exist as a democratic Jewish state. He came from a belief system that was remarkable for all of the trials and tribulations of his family and him, having to be deployed as often as he was, he never once lost sight of the underlying love and commitment he had to the state of Israel, which was infectious because this guy was not only one tough hombre, he was what we would call, and you've heard this expression, Ari, a sabra. He was really tough on the outside, but sweet on the inside. And you see that wonderful picture of him with his wife. He smiled in his sleep. For a guy who had the roughest, toughest jobs in Israel's military history, this was a man who could joke with the best of them.
Really appreciate you sharing that, Ambassador. And I know these are personally trying times for so many. And then you also have the expertise in the background, which, as I mentioned, is why we've called on you before. So thank you for sharing that. I understand the family is okay with sharing that. And Ambassador Ginsberg, we appreciate your time tonight. We will be right back.